Okay, I'd like to go over some of the material necessary to work on this assignment. We saw that what we want to do here is we need to go through some loop and process each student one at a time. So what we're going to do is we're going to, let's say Bob Smith is the first student. We're going to ask for the student's name, and we're going to ask for a midterm grade and a final grade. And we're going to be storing that in a list. And we saw the reason we need to do this is because if we have just simple variables, once I get Bob Smith's name and his midterm and final, and I come back and get the next student's information, I'm going to end up wiping out Bob Smith. The reason we need to keep Bob Smith is because we wanted to calculate the deviation, and we saw in order to calculate deviation, we need to get all the students there first in order to get the class average, because the deviation is the difference between the student, a particular student, and the class average. So unless we keep all the students, we can't print a report like this. We could, as we did for the first assignment that had to do with class average, we could, with the grade list, we could actually have printed out Bob Smith, midterm, final, and average, but this we could not do, right? Because what we did was we processed one student at a time. So we need to do that with a list. Now the question is how we do this. So we're going to have the following lists. We're going to have a list. One of the lists is going to be for the student's name. Another list is going to be for the midterm. Another list is going to be for the final. We could also keep a list with the average, though we don't really need that because as we go through the loop at the end, we could be calculating the average as we go through that loop. But we certainly need to accumulate the class average. So every time we get some students' average, we could update the average class average variable, and we also need to keep a count of how many students there are. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to ask what the size of the array, the length of the array is, and the length of the array is going to tell us how many elements there are. So let's just take a look how we might do something like that. So here is an example of what such a program might look like if you were to start this program. What I have up here is I'm declaring an array. I'm creating an array called names, a list, and what this means is the list starts out as empty. There's nothing in this over here. And then that's where I'm going to store my names. Then mid is where I'm going to store my midterms, final where the final is going to be stored, and average for the averages. Now it's very important to realize that there's nothing in here. So at this point I can't even say, let's say for example I want to access something in the name sub 0. If I were to say something like go to the array names and go to the 0th element of that, and I try to run that through Python, it would give me an error message because empty means nothing. There's nothing in there. Name sub 0, since we index the array starting at 0, since we index this list starting at 0, this won't work because there's nothing in the 0th element. So in order to get elements in there, we're going to have to use the append function down here. So I create these arrays, names and midterm and final and average. And now what I do is I ask my user for a name. So input, and input's going to give me back a string. And I say, please enter the student's name. When Python reaches this, it's going to print, please enter a student's name. I'm going to type a name. And the name that I type is going to go into this variable name. This is a regular variable. It's no longer a, this is not a list. This is a regular variable. There's a string in here now. Now I test that string name against done. And as long as name is not equal to done, I'm going to do everything in this loop. The loop has just these two commands in it right now. And the first thing that happens is if I type, for example, Bob as the first student's name, Bob is not equal to done. It's going to then take Bob, which is in this variable name, and append it to names. And names will now have, names will be a list, and names will have Bob in that list. So Bob will be the first element of that list, and that is going to be at name sub 0. So if I were to ask at that point, show me what's at name sub 0, it's going to say Bob. Then it's going to ask me for the next student's name, and it's going to keep going in this list, and as long as I don't enter the word done, it's going to append to the end of that list. So if it's Sally and Jim and so on and so forth, it's going to create all of them. Then when I'm finished, I simply type done, and it'll the while loop will be terminated. A print statement is going to say list of names. I'm going to go to the next line. It's now going to print that whole list, right? The list is going to be called names. It's now going to print all the names in that list. And then I just do this again just to show you that once I have that list, I can print them out by indexing them. Now, because since the list has elements, there is a name sub 0, name sub 1, and so on. And at that point, I can actually use the index I, and the I is the index of my for loop over here. And how many elements do I have in the list? So there's a built-in function that works on lists, and that function is called len, and len tells me how many of the elements are in here. Now remember, since the range starts at 0, and it goes to 1 less than whatever the end value is. So if names has 6 elements, so then len of names will be 6. But remember, the elements of my list are indexed from 0 to 5, so this is exactly to give me all of the elements. Let's actually run the program now and see what happens when I do this. Okay, so we're ready to run, and Python says enter a student's name. So let's say the first student is Bob. I should be right over here. First student is Bob. Enter student's name. Let's say Charlie. And then let's say Sally. And then Kim. And then Betty. And then let's say that's it. So I now type done. And what should happen, as we saw in the program, is it should exit the loop, right? The reason it's exiting the loop is because right now we're up here. We've entered a name, and if I put done over here, it comes back to the top of the loop, checks the value of the variable name. It's now done, so it's no longer going to be true that name is not equal to done, because name is equal to done. I exit the while loop, and I'm going to do the prints. Okay, so let's see that work. Here we go. So I enter done, and now it prints list of names. And then when I said print names, it prints it as a list, right? Notice this is a list notation. There's a bracket over here, a bracket over here. Have Bob, Charlie, Sally, Kim, and Betty. And now it prints it out again, and this is because it was printing in that for loop that I have. And I printed for I goes from 0, because I didn't specify where it's going from. It'll tend the length of the list. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it went from 0 to 4. And this is name sub 0, name sub 1, name sub 2, name sub 3, name sub 4. And that's basically how it works. Now, for you to finish the program, of course, you have to add additional things here. What you need to do here, of course, is not only get the names, but you need to get the midterm grade, the final grade, and calculate the average. And so that means, in terms of what you see over here, you'll need to do something like this. Right after you get the name of the student, you're going to need to get the student's information. So we'll come down over here, and right over here, right, you're going to have to put the getting information into the midterm and the final and so on. Now let's see how you might do that. So let's say you get the first student's name. The first student's name is Bob. Now you want to get Bob's midterms grade. You could do it in the following way, right? Of course, everything's going to go here. I'm just writing it down over here. You're going to say, well, take the list mid, and what are you going to do to mid? So you want to get a name, and you want to append. You want to get a midterm grade, and you want to append it. So you can do it like this. You can either do what we did before, create a variable called, let's say, m, and then append that, or you can even do something like this. You say mid dot append, and what do I want to append? I want to append the midterm grade that I get, but I don't have a midterm grade, so I can say, well, let me get a midterm grade like this. I'm going to call the input function, and the input function is going to give me some value, and I'm going to float that value. Say append float of input of the following. I want to say, let's say, please enter midterm grade. Close this. And we need to close everything over here, right? So we're going to need to close this. There's not enough room on the screen, but we're going to need to close this one here, and we're going to need to close this one over here, and we're going to need to close this one over here. So it's going to be a bunch of of these things here. You can't see them because the screen is running out on me here. We need to close all that stuff. At that point, let's say if I enter a midterm grade of 95, so 95 will be entered as a string. That will be floated. It's going to return that float value. That float value is going to be appended to mid. So at that point, the first value of the midterm, which will correspond to the first name that you entered, is going to be in the 0th element of the mid list. And likewise, I'm going to say, give me a final grade, and then I can calculate average, and we just work on there from that point.